This lesson will cover chapters 3 and 4 of 2 Chronicles. Chapter 3 discusses the beginning of the building of the temple, and then chapter 3 discusses the pillars and the vessels and the ark having been brought in to the Holy of Holies. 2 Chronicles chapter 3 verse 1. Then Solomon began to build the house of the Lord at Jerusalem in Mount Moriah, where the Lord appeared unto David his father, in the place that David had prepared in the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite. Now that back in 1 Chronicles, we learned that David was told to purchase this threshing floor from this person. And this is the very same place where in Genesis 20 that Abraham prepared an altar to sacrifice Isaac. This is that very same identical place. And Ornan, he bought the threshing floor, and the temple will be on that place. 2. And he began to build in the 2nd day of the 2nd month in the 4th year of his reign, and that would have been 917 BC according to Bullinger, and would have been some 573 years after they came out of Egypt. Now, Kings gives the year as 910, but it rounds up some months. It was 7 years plus some months. So this would maybe account for that difference. 4:3. Now there are the things wherein Solomon was instructed for the building of the house of God. The length by cubits after the first measure was 80 cubits, and the breadth 20 cubits. Now, a cubit would be the distance between the king's elbow and his third finger, and that would have varied depending upon the height and the length of the arm of the king. If we round it to let's say 24 feet, then this building would have been 120 feet long and 40 feet wide. And of course there's the main room, and then there were side rooms for the treasury and for storage, and of course those priests who came in serving courses needed places to live and to eat while they were serving their week in Jerusalem. 4. And the porch that was in the front of the house, the length of it was according to the breadth of the house, 20 cubits, and the height was 120, and he overlaid it within with pure gold. Now, if it was 120 cubits, it would come out to 240 feet, and Bullinger says that it was more like 20 cubits rather than 120. So some often times we have copyist errors, but we have had persons like Bullinger who are capable of reading the original and make corrections for us. 5. And the greater house he sealed with fir tree, which he overlaid with fine gold, and set thereon palm trees and chains. Chains would have been a gold wire that would have been twisted, and then ornamentation could be attached to those gold wires. And the palm tree, of course, is considered to be a giver of life. Number 6, and he garnished the house with precious stones for beauty. And the gold was gold of Parvaim. Now, Parvaim, according to J.L. Strong, is an oriental region that is famous for gold reserves. The stones and would have been hewn out away, and from Ophir, these fir, this timber that was used for the house. 7, he overlaid also the house, the beams, the posts, and the walls thereof, and the doors thereof with gold, and graved cherubim on the walls. These beams and posts would have been doorways, and cherubim would have been protecting angels, the only angels with wings. Verses 8 through 14 will describe the Holy of Holies, and only priests were in the inner court, and only high priest went in the Holy of Holies where the ark was placed, and that was only one day a year, on the Day of Atonement, which is the 10th day of the Jewish month Tishrei. Number 8, and he made the most holy house. The length thereof was according to the breadth of the house, 20 cubits, and the breadth thereof 20 cubits, and he overlaid it with fine gold, amounting to 600 talents. Now this gold would have been beaten out into sheets, and it would have been attached with gold nails, because no iron was allowed to be used in the temple. And this size of this temple here would have been double what the size of the tabernacle, the tent that moved and served as a place of sacrifice and worship during the earlier periods. 10, and in the most holy house he made 2 cherubim of image work. This would have been carved, and overlaid them with gold. Sometimes the Holy of Holies is called an oracle, and where one would seek God's voice. And these 2 cherubims, of course, would have been the work of this Huram or Huram, who came from Tyre, but as we learned earlier, his genealogy was the house of Naphtali and Dan, and his mother had married a person in Tyre. So he was an Israelite, this artisan here who was working. It not necessarily mean that he did all this work himself. He would have had a great lot of help. Higher critics like to bring up Exodus 20 and say, oh, you've got to grave an image, but the law reads that you're not to bow down to it. And of course there have been critics who say, oh my, that was angel worship. These cherubim were there to protect the mercy seat. And we learn in Ezekiel 28 that that old king of Tyre, who was Satan, promoted himself, and he's described as being full of beauty. His job, he was a cherubim, his job was to protect the mercy seat, but his pride took over and he wished to sit on it, and that is a place reserved for Jesus. 11. And the wings of the cherubim were 20 cubits long. One wing of one cherub was 5 cubits, reaching in the wall of the house, and the other wing was likewise 5 cubits, reaching to the wing of the other cherub. So they're side by side, and they're standing wingtip to wingtip, and they're the entire width, halfway between the floor and the ceiling, and they would have been 20 feet tall. Now, if you've looked at recent news and seen the Ark of the Covenant that has been discovered, and it has 2 cherubim on the top, in which no way approach the size described here. 12. And one wing of the other cherub was 5 cubits, reaching to the wall of the house, and the other wing was 5 cubits also, joining to the wing of the other cherub. So they were along the entire width of that wall. They were not 2 little winged angels sitting up on top of the ark. 13. The wings of these cherubim spread themselves forth 20 cubits, that's 40 feet. And they stood on their feet, and their faces were inward. In other words, they were facing inward toward the ark. 14. And he, that would be Huram, not necessarily himself, but supervising this work, because there were, of course, Israeli artisans as well who worked under his supervision to complete this very intricate artistic work. 14. And he made the veil of blue and purple and crimson and fine linen and wrought cherubim thereon. Those are the colors of royalty, and it separated the entrance to the Holy of Holies from the inner court. And as I said, only the high priest went into that. And the fact that he said they were wrought onto that veil, it means that they were made and they were looked as though they were ascending. And remember in Matthew, the description of the happenings at the time of Jesus' death, Matthew 27, the veil rent from the top to the bottom, from heaven down, and that was a symbol that we don't need a high priest any longer. We have a high priest. He is Jesus. He's our intercessor, and we can go to God ourselves as individuals. 15. Also, he made before the house 2 pillars of 30 and 5 cubits high, and the chapiter that was on the top of each of them was 5 cubits. 1 Kings chapter 7 tells us that these were 18 cubits, and together would have been 36 feet. So here, those 2 pillars, that height is a combined height, and they would have been 18 cubits plus 5, 23 cubits altogether. And actually, in a combined height, if it if you do the math, it's 35 rather than 36, and the 18 has been rounded up from 17.5 cubits to an even number, 16. And he made chains, that's lattice work, as in the oracle. The oracle, of course, as I said, Holy of Holies, and put them on the heads of the pillars, and made 100 pomegranates and put them on the chains. Once again, that would be wreath work of gold wire. And the pomegranates. Why pomegranates? Pomegranates, if you've eaten one, you know you are just eating a mass of seeds. And symbolically, we are supposed to be seed planters. 17 to complete this chapter 3. And he reared up the pillars before the temple, one on the right hand and the other on the left, and he called the name of that one on the right Jachin, and the one on the left Boaz. And those names, Jachin means he shall establish, and Boaz means in it is strength. And here, with God's instructions to build this temple, he is establishing a covenant and with people, and we have a temple today. We can take refuge in our Lord Jesus Christ. Chapter 4, verse 1. Moreover, he made an altar of brass, 20 cubits the length thereof, and 20 cubits the breadth thereof, and 10 cubits the height thereof. This altar of brass, that would have been 40 feet by 40 feet by 20 feet. And these would have been for the burnt offerings that would be offered, and the whole animal, except for the hide and entrails, were offered here. And then on major events, Passover, Feast of Tabernacles, and the first Feast of the First Fruits, these would have been, there would have been additional altars set up because of the great number of sacrifices that would have been done at that time. 2. And he made a molten sea of 10 cubits from brim to brim, round in compass, and 5 cubits the height thereof, and a line of 30 cubits did compass it round about. This molten sea, brazen sea, this was where the priests washed themselves, and it would have been 20 feet wide and a circumference of 60 feet, quite a large piece of brass. The next verses describe this molten sea. And under it was a similitude of oxen, which did compass it round about 10 in cubit, compassing the sea round about. 2 rows of oxen were cast when it was cast. And once again, Moffat comes to the rescue of a copy error. It would have been not oxen here, but gourd, like rosettes. And over in Kings, they are called naps, Knaps, and those are gourds. And of course, they would have been cast in clay, melted brass poured in to form these, and those clay beds that were used for all this work that was cast was near the Jordan River. 4. It stood upon 12 oxen, 3 looking toward the north, and 3 looking toward the west, and 3 looking toward the south, and 3 looking toward the east. And the sea was set above them, and all their hinder parts were inward. Now these are real oxen, and they are facing outward from the sea, and these are not the gourds. There's 3 facing in each direction, and that magic number 12, 12 tribes, 12 apostles, and that was the resting place for this huge molten brass sea, or it was really, when you consider the dimensions we were given, a small swimming pool. 5, and the thickness of it was a hand breadth, and the brim of it like the work of the brim of a cup. In other words, it turned downward, and with flowers of lilies, and it received and held 3,000 baths. Now, the 3,000 baths, a bath would have been 4.5 to 5.5 gallons. And back in 1 Kings, it said it took 2,000 baths. Well, it sounds like that's something that doesn't add, that there's a difference. If you have a swimming pool and you fill it all the way to the brim, it'd be hard to use. So the 3,000 here in Chronicles is the full to the brim, and the 2,000 that's mentioned in Kings is the fewer gallons that are the baths there, so that it's usable. Okay, how much are 3,000 baths? Well, it would have been about 10,000 gallons. Remember the Nephilim, the people who were next door neighbors who came in and pretended that they had walked a long way, and they had managed to beat up their shoes and clothes and said they would work, and they were given the job of hauling water and wood, and they would have been the workforce who would have changed the water out of this thing, and we don't know how often it was changed. 6, he, and that once again is Huram, called Huram here in Chronicles, made 10 lavers and put 5 on the right and 5 on the left to wash in them. Such things as they offered for the burnt offering, they washed in them, but the sea was for the priests to wash in. And that those burnt animals, in Leviticus, we learned that they were washed before they were offered up. And 1 Kings, in describing these vessels, says that they would contain 40 baths. So that would have been 40 times about 5 gallons. 7, and he made 10 candlesticks of gold according to their form, and set them in the temple, 5 on the right and 5 on the left. The candlesticks symbolizing light and truth. 8, he made also 10 tables and placed them in the temple, 5 on the right, 5 on the left. And he made 100 basins of gold. Now those tables would have been for the showbread. The showbread was changed out on the Sabbath, and on the Sabbath the priest ate the showbread. And if you remember back in earlier studies of David in 1 Chronicles, that he went into the temple and asked for the showbread, and Ahimelech was the high priest, and Saul ordered him and a great number killed because of that. Now, Moses did not have in his tabernacle all these candlesticks. He had one 8-branched menorah. We are familiar with that name. And that showbread means the bread of the face. And Moses only had one table. He had to pack up and move the tabernacle numerous times. Now, and furthermore, he, once again, Huram, made the court of the priest and the great court, that's the outer court, and doors for the court, and overlaid the doors of them with brass. Now, that outer court there would have had folding doors. 10. And he set the sea on the right side of the east end over against the south. And that, of course, it was on the right side, that sea, where the priest would wash themselves in that vessel that held so many thousand gallons. 11. And Huram, or Hiram, as he's called in Kings, made the pots and the shovels and the basins. And Huram finished the work that he was to make for King Solomon for the house of God. Of course, he had a great lot of help. And of course, Solomon was a builder. He was building more than just the temple. We learned back in an earlier chapter that there were 153,600 working. And as I said, the artisans existed amongst the Hebrews, and Huram did not do all this himself. He would have supervised. Verses 12 through 18 catalog the use of brass in the temple and outside. To wit, the 2 pillars and the pommels and the chapiters which were on the top of the 2 pillars, and the 2 wreaths to cover the 2 temples of the chapiters were on the top of the pillars. The pillars here are outside. Pommels would be bowls that were on the crown. They would have contained oil, which could have been burned, set on fire for light. 13. And 400 pomegranates on the 2 wreaths, 2 rows of pomegranates on each wreath to cover the 2 pommels of the chapiters which were on the pillars. Those are crowns up there, and those would be wreaths, networks of wire like lattice, and the pomegranates, molten brass, would have been attached to that wreath work. 14. He made also bases, and lavers made he upon the bases. These would hold about 200 gallons of water, these basins, and they would, according to Levitical law, they would have washed the legs and the innards of the animals. And we learn in Kings that these had wheels. And if you've seen drawings or illustrations of Solomon's temple, you will see that on the outside they had these wheeled basins, and they were for washing animals for sacrifice. 1c. He made also bases, and lavers made he upon the bases. 15. 1c, and 12 oxen under it. That's the big brass sea. 16. The pots also, and the shovels, and the flesh hooks, and all their instruments did Huram his father make to King Solomon for the house of the Lord. That is confusing there, that he's called his father. That usage is not a biological father, it's a counselor. And these flesh hooks, they would have been to reach down into a meal offering and to extract some of the meat that it could be eaten. And the bright brass, those would be scoured or shiny brass. And shovels and all of those things that he made would have been used to take ashes out. And of course, they were to take those ashes out of the city to a clean place. And as I said, the flesh hook was used in the peace offering, a sacrificial meal that a person could use that flesh hook to draw out a portion to eat. 17. In the plain of Jordan did the king cast them in the clay ground between Succoth and Zeradathah. And as I said, that would have been close to the Jordan because of the clay there that would have made it easy to cast these items out of gold and brass. 18. Thus Solomon made all these vessels in great abundance, for the weight of the brass could not be found out. Much brass. In the third siege of the Babylonians, they broke that sea apart and hauled it away. And earlier, the first and second sieges of the Nebuchadnezzar, they hauled away all of those vessels and gold cups and so forth. And in Daniel 5, we learned that Nebuchadnezzar's son Belshazzar had a drunken party and drank out of these vessels that were used in the temple. And a hand wrote on the wall and it said, "Your kingdom is found wanting." And the kingdom went to the Persians, and Belshazzar was dead in 24 hours. 19 through 22, we are concerned once again with gold. 19. And Solomon made all the vessels that were for the house of God, the golden altar also, and the tables whereon the showbread was set. 20. Moreover, the candlesticks with their lamps, that they should burn after the manner before the oracle of pure gold. Those that were out there in front of the Holy of Holies. And remember that the pattern for this temple was given to David by God. 21. And the flowers and the lamps and tongs made he of gold, and that perfect gold, the purest available. Verse 22 to conclude this chapter. And the snuffers and the basins and the spoons and the censers of pure gold, and the entry of the house, the inner doors thereof, for the most holy place, and the doors of the house of the temple were of gold. Those basins would have been bowls. And Hezekiah, as we move forward into this book of Chronicles, we will find that he gave the gold off of the doors to Sennacherib to try to buy peace. This concludes our lesson on the temple. In the next lesson, we will have the consecration This video has been an outreach of the Essex Methodist Church in Essex, Missouri, and the Crossroads Global Methodist Church in Dexter, Missouri.